Camera Raw has so many settings in it, it's like its own program. Gee, there's another program called Lightroom where it is a full program that has all those sliders in it. And it's enough to sell as a product where people aren't dissatisfied with it. So that's why we spend so much time in Camera Raw. Because ideally, I might finish 70% of all my images just in Camera Raw because we got so much available in one dialog. And everything that's here is being stored on this picture as text. So that picture went up about 8K in file size. 8K is if I took an email and saved it as a text file with no pictures in it whatsoever, that might be 8K, just a text email. That's how much in file size it went up. If we did that in Photoshop, we would have the raw file, and since we can't save back into a raw file, we'd have a TIFF or a Photoshop file, which is going to be larger than the original raw, so we've at least doubled our file size, if not more. Start adding layers in there to make changes. In Photoshop, we're adding layers so we can easily undo things and fix problems. Well, in Camera Raw, everything's undoable. Double-click on any slider, it snaps to its default setting. And working in Camera Raw is just, that's where I want to be. And it's only Photoshop. I only go there when there's something Camera Raw can't do or would be too inconvenient to do there. And there's a lot of stuff. Well, that's what we'll be doing after this session. But I just want to stress that because a lot of people I find if they don't shoot raw, they skip Camera Raw. And I'm like, no, do it in there. Do Camera Raw. All right. I want to show you some things in here that you might somewhat be considered retouching, but it's not true retouching. It's really adjustment, but it could be somewhat in the same category. When you adjust an image, there's a slider called Clarity. And Clarity emphasizes the detail in your image, makes it kind of pop a bit more. It's somewhat similar to sharpening, but not really, because sharpening ends up, if you look really close at an image, if you over sharpen it, you'll see halos that are really, really small, like little lines around the edges of things. And this doesn't produce really small halos. It can produce, if it ever produces anything, it looks like a huge glow. But this is something somewhat similar to sharpening. And the problem with it is if you apply it to people's faces, they look older because every little detail in their face is emphasized. And if you do that to anybody, you're going to look older. And so I'll show you how to get it off their face and do a few other things to your face you might want to. But before I do that, this picture, the last time it was adjusted with an old version of Camera Raw. And I can tell that by one thing. Look in the lower right corner. Do you see an exclamation point right there? Well, if you ever see something like that, and it's an icon, you don't know what it means, hover over it. Right? That says update to current process. What that means is process this picture using this version of Camera Raw. Right now, this was adjusted previously with an old version of Camera Raw. They've updated the sliders to make them better, and they are not applying that because they think you want it to maintain the look. Because if you open in an old file, you might just be wanting to make a print, and you need the print to match what the previous ones you've made look like. So if I click on that, you'll see the sliders on the right actually change, because those are the old type of sliders. And the look of the picture will change because we can't reproduce the exact same look with the new kind of sliders. You'd have to fine-tune it again. So remember here that we have a clarity setting being applied to this that right now is at +25. I'm going to go to the adjustment brush at the top of my screen. And with the adjustment brush, I'm going to zero out everything that's here. And I'm going to take the clarity setting and set it to -25. So if we have +25 being applied to the entire picture, and now we're going to paint -25, it's not that where I paint will get the equivalent to -25. We're just going to bring it back down to 0 where I painted. There's +25 everywhere. We're saying take that +25 and bring it down this amount. So if it's already at +25, when we bring it down by this amount, we're bringing it down to 0. Does that make sense? We're just compensating. And I'm going to come over here and paint on her face. Make sure my feathering is up. And that's going to be wiping away the clarity that's being applied to the entire picture. And it's being nice to her, because clarity being applied to a face makes all the tiny little wrinkles and imperfections in the skin become emphasized. Now, I want the clarity on her eyes, because I want her eyes to pop, and it doesn't make somebody look older by making their eyes pop, but it does making all their wrinkles and that kind of stuff pop does. So we just got the clarity down to the equivalent to 0. Now, if I click on that icon in the lower right, remember that ends up changing the preview, it might be somewhat subtle, but you should see her skin changing. Well, when it comes to faces, the clarity slider, when we're adjusting the main part of the image, we're not in this brush, instead we're just adjusting the picture as a whole, can go either into the positive side where it exaggerates detail, or you can actually put it in a negative direction. And if you do negative, it softens your picture. It's not that common that I would apply negative clarity to my entire picture, because it would make my image look rather soft. But for faces, if we have any little wrinkles and imperfections in the face, a little negative clarity is what a lot of people like, because they want their face to look smoother than it really is. Because when you look at somebody, when I'm standing in the room here and I look over at someone, I'm not going to stare at them and inspect every little detail in their face. But take a photo of them and they're not looking back at you. Their eyes aren't going to move, and if you stare at their forehead, they're not going to say, "What's up? What are you looking at my forehead for?" And so it's a little different looking at a photo compared to just looking at a person, and bringing it down clarity so you go even further than just getting rid of the amount that's being applied to the whole thing can be a nice thing to do. If we bring it down too far, it's going to look artificial though, so it's a matter of finding a nice balance between softening of the skin and realistic rendering. So anyway, if I got this at -25 and that's to compensate for what's being applied to the whole image, then I might push it a little bit further, bring it up to -35 or somewhere around there, and it's actually softening the skin at this point. Okay? So therefore, it's going to be harder to see the detail that was there. And it's just a little bit softer. I don't want it to be dramatic because I don't want it to look like I did it. Okay? Some other things we can do is that people often drink way too much coffee or smoke or do other things that are not good for their teeth. If you have a lot of coffee or smoke a lot and stuff, your teeth are going to slowly get darker. And if we want to compensate for that, what I would do is up here where it says adjustment brush, if we were working on one of these sliders, in fact I never got that to -35, there we go, because that dot wasn't active. Okay, if I want to do something with your teeth, up here with the adjustment brush, if the last thing you did was click on your image and drag to apply something and then play with the sliders, this will be set to add, which means if I click on my image again, just work on a larger area of my picture, because I'm just fine-tuning how much of the image I want you to apply this to. So each time you click, you're adding a larger and larger area to make the change in. But I'm going to go over here and choose New to say I'm done with that particular adjustment. Before, there was a black dot in the middle of that pin that's on her face, meaning that it was active. Once I chose New, the black dot went away to say I'm no longer working on that adjustment. I'm going to create a new adjustment. Now I can zero out these sliders and decide what would I like to do to her teeth. Well, for her teeth, I might want to bring the saturation down just a little. Careful though, if you bring the saturation down too much, their teeth will look gray. I mean, an undesirable gray. But bringing down the saturation a little bit is not a bad thing. The other thing that I might do is take the highlights, the bright parts of the image, and brighten them. Now right now I'm only guessing at what it needs because the picture doesn't change when I just move these sliders because I haven't painted anywhere yet. It doesn't know where I want that change. So right now I'm just guesstimating what kind of change I want. So I'm guessing a little bit less saturation and my highlights a bit brighter. Now I got to paint it in. So I'm going to come down here and make sure that the checkbox called Auto Mask is turned on. Auto Mask is the one that tries to make it so I don't get overspray onto the surrounding areas. And then I can zoom up on this image and might get a brush with a little less fade out on it, something like that. And I'm going to click now on her tooth, drag across, and try to get it so the crosshair on my brush never goes beyond her tooth. I let go on this tooth, go to the next one, let go, go to the next one. The reason I'm letting go between teeth is I don't want the crosshair to touch the gap between the teeth, because when you have auto mask turned on, it means don't get overspray on things that look different than what's under that crosshair. And if you get to the gap between the teeth might look like the gums. And I don't want stuff on the gums. So I let go when I'm in between the teeth, click again on the next tooth, keep the crosshair only on the tooth, let go, next tooth, let go, next tooth, let go. That kind of thing. Now that I've painted on the image, I can fine-tune the adjustment, because before I was just guessing at what it needs. I couldn't see the effect of the change. Now that I've painted on the image, if I move the sliders, I'm actually going to see a change, and I can come in here now and dial up exactly how bright her teeth are. And I can see if that saturation, if it goes too far, do you see her gray teeth? Okay. See if I can bring that down just a little. That type of thing. And if you want to see before and after, I can click on that icon to get both her skin softening and her teeth whitening to go away. The other thing you could do in this image or in images in general are lips. You can make a little bit darker and a little bit more saturated. Not a lot, otherwise they'll look like a cartoon, but oftentimes people like it. You know, that's why people put lipstick on, you know, stuff. Darken, a little bit more colorful. And then the eyes. You could paint on the eyes, and you could bring up the clarity to make our eyes kind of sparkle a little bit. In this case, I might bring up the shadows slider to brighten them up a little bit. But it's just some ideas that you might think of that some people would consider retouching, but I think of retouching as removing and moving material around. This is just adjustment. So that's why I'm not doing it in the retouching session. And when we're done, of course, we hit done. All right. So questions, comments?
Yeah, we have one two-part question from Gina.
Yeah.
If sharpening in Adobe Camera Raw, do you ever need to add additional sharpening in Photoshop?
Yes, we'll talk about that in the last session of the day.
Great.
You often will sharpen an image twice, and just to briefly mention it, in Camera Raw, we're trying to only compensate for the camera. If it delivered the image being slightly soft, we're compensating. If we do it in Photoshop, we're going to try to compensate for whatever printing device we use. If it doesn't make your images look nice and sharp, we're going to try to compensate for it by sharpening it a second time. Okay? And that's more after we're done making any changes in Photoshop, we would sharpen again. Okay?
Awesome. The second half is, if you're sharpening in Photoshop, does it matter where the sharpening layer is actually located? Does it always need to be on top?
Yeah, well, what happens is when you apply a filter in Photoshop, the filter can only affect one layer unless you have something called a smart object. And so if we have an image made out of multiple layers, you're going to have to combine those layers together. You can flatten your image, it's called, and then you can sharpen it. What I'll often do, because I don't want to permanently sharpen anything, is I'll just open the image and make a duplicate, flatten the duplicate, sharpen it, send it off to somebody, and then throw it away. Meaning I have the original layered file I can always go back to if somebody else needs an image, and I can always open it again. I can duplicate it, flatten it, and all that, because you also want to do your second sharpening after you've resized it to the final size. Because if you sharpen something that when it's really big and later on scale it down for business card use, you're not going to notice the sharpening because you just reduced it so much by reducing the picture. And that's why I would do it after.